the Battle of Okinawa stands as a pivotal crucible of war, forging the fate of empires and the future of humanity. This clash of titans on a remote Pacific island would claim over 240,000 lives and shape the course of modern history. The echoes of Okinawa's bloody shores still whisper secrets to us today. In the early months of 1945, the world was ablaze with conflict as the Allied forces closed in on the Axis powers from all sides. The war in Europe was nearing its climax, with Soviet troops pushing deep into Germany and American forces crossing the Rhine River. But in the Pacific, the fight against Japan was far from over. The island of Okinawa, a small rocky outcropping in the Ryukyu chain, had become the focal point of the next great battle. Okinawa, with its lush green forests, white sand beaches, and crystal-clear waters, was a place of stunning natural beauty. But it was also a strategic location, situated just 340 miles south of Japan's main island, Kyushu. The island's airfields, ports, and anchorages made it an ideal staging ground for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. For the Allies, capturing Okinawa was essential to securing a foothold in the region and paving the way for the eventual invasion of Japan. The Japanese military, however, was determined to defend Okinawa at all costs. The island's garrison, led by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, consisted of approximately 120,000 troops, including seasoned veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army and freshly minted conscripts from the local population. Ushijima, a battle-hardened commander with a reputation for cunning and bravery, had been tasked with preparing the island's defenses against the anticipated Allied invasion. As the Allies began to assemble their forces for the assault on Okinawa, the Japanese military was busy constructing an intricate network of tunnels, bunkers, and pillboxes across the island. The defensive lines were designed to funnel the invading troops into killing zones, where they could be cut down by withering artillery and machine gun fire. The Japanese had also developed a new tactic, known as defense in depth, which involved creating multiple layers of defenses, each one more formidable than the last. The Allies, meanwhile, were gathering their forces for the invasion. The U.S. 10th Army, led by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., was tasked with carrying out the assault. Buckner's force consisted of two corps, the 24th Corps, led by Major General John R. Hodge, and the 3rd Amphibious Corps, led by Major General Roy Geiger. The invasion fleet, which included over 1,500 ships and landing craft, was the largest assembled to date in the Pacific theater. As the Allies prepared to launch their assault on Okinawa, the Japanese military was bracing for impact. The air was thick with tension, as both sides knew that the coming battle would be a fight to the death. In the days leading up to the invasion, the Allies launched a series of air and naval bombardments against Okinawa's defenses. Waves of B-29 bombers, based in the Mariana Islands, pounded the island's airfields and military installations, while U.S. warships, including the battleships USS Tennessee and USS Idaho, shelled the coastal defenses. The Japanese responded with fierce resistance, launching kamikaze attacks against the Allied fleet and firing artillery rounds at the approaching troops. As the Allied bombardments intensified, the Japanese defenders on Okinawa huddled in their underground tunnels and bunkers, waiting for the inevitable invasion. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, and the sound of artillery fire echoed through the island's valleys and hills. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the Allies launched their assault on Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg. The invasion force, consisting of over 180,000 troops, began landing on the western coast of the island, near the towns of Hagushi and Yontan. The initial wave of American Marines, led by the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, stormed ashore on the Hagushi beaches, facing relatively light resistance. The Japanese defenders had deliberately avoided strong defenses on the beaches, instead choosing to funnel the invaders into the interior of the island, where they could be more effectively attacked. As the Marines established a foothold on the beach, they began to push inland, encountering increasingly stiff resistance from Japanese troops entrenched in caves, tunnels, and pillboxes. To the north, the 77th Infantry Division landed near the town of Yontan, with the objective of securing the airfield and surrounding high ground. The division's commander, Major General Andrew D. Bruce, had been warned about the potential for strong Japanese resistance in the area, but his troops were well trained and well equipped, and they quickly overcame the initial defenses. As they pushed inland, however, they encountered fierce fighting from Japanese troops, who were determined to hold on to the strategic high ground. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions landed on the southern beaches near the town of Kadena. These divisions faced stronger resistance than the Marines to the north, as the Japanese defenders had concentrated their forces in this area. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Despite the challenges, the American troops slowly but surely began to gain ground, pushing the Japanese back into the island's interior. As the invasion force established a solid foothold on Okinawa, the Allies began to bring ashore the heavy equipment and supplies needed to sustain a long and bloody campaign. The beaches were soon crowded with tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks, as well as thousands of troops waiting to be fed into the meat grinder of combat. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, continued to fight tenaciously, using every trick in the book to slow down the Allied advance. They launched waves of kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet, sank several American ships, and even attempted to infiltrate behind enemy lines, using small boats and submarines to land sabotage teams on the island. Despite these efforts, the Allies continued to push forward, slowly but surely grinding down the Japanese defenses. On April 2nd, the Marines captured the town of Dakeshi, which gave them control of the vital crossroads at the center of the island. The next day, the Army's 7th Infantry Division secured the town of Kadena, which provided a crucial airfield and logistical hub for the invasion force. As the Allies consolidated their gains, they began to prepare for the next phase of the campaign, the bloody and brutal fight for the island's interior, where the Japanese defenders were waiting in strength. The terrain on Okinawa was ideally suited for defense, with its rugged hills, deep valleys, and numerous caves and tunnels. The Japanese had spent months preparing the island's defenses, digging complex networks of trenches and bunkers, and stockpiling ammunition and supplies. As the Allies pushed inland, they encountered increasingly strong resistance from Japanese troops, who were determined to fight to the death. On April 4th, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Wana, which controlled access to the island's northern coast. The battle was brutal, with both sides trading artillery fire and small arms rounds in a frenzy of violence. The Marines eventually emerged victorious, but at great cost. Over 200 American troops were killed or wounded in the fighting. As the Allies continued to push forward, they encountered similar resistance throughout the island, with each village and town becoming a bloody and brutal battleground. The Japanese defenders were led by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, a seasoned and skilled commander who had been tasked with defending Okinawa to the death. Ushijima was a complex figure, driven by a mix of patriotism, duty, and personal honor. He knew that the battle for Okinawa was doomed from the start, but he was determined to inflict maximum casualties on the Allies, in the hopes of convincing them to negotiate a peace treaty rather than continuing the war. As the fighting raged on, Ushijima's troops fought with increasing desperation, launching suicidal attacks and sacrificing themselves in droves to slow down the Allied advance. The Allies, meanwhile, were facing their own challenges as they struggled to maintain a steady supply of ammunition, food, and water for their troops. The invasion fleet was still offshore, and the logistics of supplying such a large force were daunting. The Americans had brought ashore vast quantities of supplies, but these were being consumed at an alarming rate, and there were concerns about running out of critical items like artillery shells and medical supplies. Despite these challenges, the Allies continued to push forward, driven by their determination to secure Okinawa and bring the war in the Pacific one step closer to its end. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly desperate. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had ordered his troops to fall back to a series of heavily fortified lines known as the Shuri Line, which stretched across the southern part of the island. The Shuri Line was a complex network of trenches, bunkers, and caves built into the rugged hills and valleys of Okinawa. It was here that Ushijima intended to make his final stand, using every trick in the book to slow down the Allied advance. As the Allies approached the Shuri Line, they were met with a hail of artillery fire and small arms rounds. the Japanese defenders had stockpiled vast quantities of ammunition and supplies, which they used to devastating effect against the advancing American troops. On April 9th, the Army's 77th Infantry Division launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Ichinomiya, which was part of the Shuri Line. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Americans were aided by their superior air power and naval gunfire, which they used to pound Japanese positions and weaken their defenses. On April 10th, a fleet of American warships, including the battleship USS Tennessee, bombarded Japanese positions along the Shuri Line, firing thousands of rounds of ammunition into the enemy's trenches and bunkers. The bombardment was devastating, killing hundreds of Japanese troops and destroying much of their infrastructure. Despite this, the Japanese defenders continued to fight on, using every available means to slow down the Allied advance. On April 12th, a group of Japanese commandos managed to sneak ashore and attack an American supply depot, killing several troops and destroying vital equipment. The Allies responded by increasing their own security measures, deploying more troops to guard against potential infiltrators and saboteurs. They also stepped up their artillery bombardments, using every available gun to pound Japanese positions and weaken their defenses. On April 14th, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Awasha, which was part of the Shuri Line. As the fighting raged on, the Allies began to make slow but steady progress, pushing the Japanese defenders back inch by inch. On April 15th, the Army's 77th Infantry Division captured the town of Miyahara, which gave them control of a vital crossroads and access to the southern part of the island. The next day, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Kunishi, which was part of the Shuri Line. The Japanese defenders were becoming increasingly exhausted, their numbers dwindling as they suffered heavy losses in the fighting. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima knew that his troops could not hold out for much longer, but he was determined to inflict maximum casualties on the Allies before surrendering. On April 18th, he ordered his troops to launch a final, desperate counterattack against the American lines, using every available soldier and every last ounce of ammunition. The counterattack was fierce, with Japanese troops charging forward in waves, armed with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. The Americans were caught off guard, but they quickly regrouped and launched a devastating counterattack of their own. In the end, the Japanese defenders were repelled, but not before they had inflicted significant losses on the American troops. As the Japanese counterattack was repelled, the Americans continued to push forward, slowly but steadily gaining ground on the Shuri Line. As the Americans continued to push forward, they began to encounter increasingly strong resistance from the Japanese defenders. The Americans were forced to call in air support, and waves of fighter bombers pounded the Japanese positions, weakening their defenses. Despite the intense fighting, the Americans continued to make slow but steady progress, pushing the Japanese defenders back inch by inch. The Americans were aided by their superior firepower, and they used every available gun to pound the Japanese positions and weaken their defenses. As the fighting raged on, the Japanese defenders began to show signs of exhaustion. Their numbers were dwindling and their supplies were running low. The next day, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Shuri, which was the capital of Okinawa and the headquarters of the Japanese 32nd Army. On April 28th, the Marines captured the town of Shuri, but not before the Japanese defenders had inflicted significant losses on them. As the Army's 77th Infantry Division battled for control of Yonabaru, the Marines continued their push towards the southern tip of Okinawa, encountering fierce resistance from the Japanese defenders. On May 1st, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Takeshi, which was part of the Shuri Line's outer defenses. The battle was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but ultimately, the Marines emerged victorious, securing the town and paving the way for further advances. Meanwhile, the Army's 77th Infantry Division, supported by the 7th Infantry Division, continued to push southwards, aiming to capture the key towns of Naha and Itaman. On May 2nd, the 77th Infantry Division launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Ishimine, which was a strategic location controlling access to the southern part of the island. After fierce fighting, the Americans secured the town, but not before the Japanese defenders had inflicted significant losses. As the battle raged on, the Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, realized that his forces were on the brink of collapse. Despite his best efforts to rally his troops, the Japanese defenses were crumbling, and the Americans were closing in on all sides. On May 4th, Ushijima ordered his remaining forces to fall back to the southernmost tip of Okinawa, where they would make a final stand. The Americans, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage, pushing forward with renewed intensity. On May 5th, the Marines launched a major assault on the Japanese-held town of Sugarloaf Hill, which was a key location controlling access to the southern part of the island. As the battle entered its final phase, the Americans began to encounter increasing numbers of Japanese civilians who were caught in the crossfire and struggled to survive amidst the chaos. On May 10th, the Americans established a refugee camp at the town of Itamen, where they provided food, shelter, and medical care to thousands of displaced Okinawans. On May 22nd, the Army's 77th Infantry Division, supported by the Marines, launched a final assault on the Japanese-held town of Mabuni, which was the last remaining stronghold of the Japanese defenders. After fierce fighting, the Americans secured the town, and General Ushijima, realizing that all was lost, took his own life, along with his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho. With the death of their commander, the remaining Japanese forces on Okinawa began to surrender, and by June 22nd, the battle was officially over. The Americans had secured the island, but at a terrible cost. Over 12,000 American soldiers had been killed, and more than 55,000 wounded. The Japanese had suffered even heavier losses, with estimates suggesting that up to 110,000 soldiers had been killed, along with thousands of civilians. As the battle came to an end, the Americans began the process of occupying and rebuilding Okinawa, which would remain under American control until 1972. The island's infrastructure was in ruins, and a local population was struggling to survive amidst the devastation. The Americans established a military government which worked to restore order, provide humanitarian aid, and rebuild the island's economy. The capture of Okinawa provided the Americans with a vital staging post for a potential invasion of mainland Japan, and it marked a significant turning point in the Pacific War. The battle had been one of the bloodiest and most intense of the war, but ultimately, it had paved the way for the Allied victory that would come just a few months later. The Battle of Okinawa will forever be etched in the annals of history as a pivotal and devastating clash that ultimately paved the way for the Allied victory in World War II. The bravery, sacrifice, and resilience displayed by the soldiers and civilians on both sides serve as a poignant reminder of the profound human cost of war. The Battle of Okinawa may be a distant memory, but its impact continues to reverberate, a somber testament to the enduring legacy of war and the indomitable human spirit. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.